bundle of concepts which I hope to unpick over the next few minutes before we proceed into the main content of the talk. So the running order, this is probably more for me than it is for you, but we'll basically do a light intro, establish first principles, move to the overview of the book. Then I'm going to do a deep dive or something like a deep dive into one of the chapters, and it's a chapter I think is particularly important, which is about overheating, and then we'll do Q&A, and then I'm at your mercy. So let's begin. So, who am I? Architect, developer, author, ex-public servant, but I'm not sure if there anything is like an ex-public servant. You always, once you get into the line of work, it kind of stays with you. You care about the environment and the overlaps between policy and people. And a founder of my company called Romullus, and Romullus, in very simple terms, decarbonizes buildings using AI infrastructure. So why did I try to write a book like this? There's probably a longer story I could go into, but in true healthonomic fashion, I'll use a few graphs to explain it. So this is a graph from the Lancet, and it basically tracks the number of scientific publications about climate change and health. And what you'll notice in blue is just how many publications there are on the impacts. There is nothing like anything in the same order of magnitude for adaptation or mitigation, which are really the things that we probably care about if the impacts are as great as we say they are. And that's part of the reason I wrote this book, because there just isn't enough information and guidance for us as companies, individuals, practitioners to be able to understand how we grapple with what is a really multi-headed challenge. This is probably another graph that kind of explains it. Here we have effectively a number of companies by sector. I'll break down where we are by sector that mention health, climate change, or the intersection of the two in their communications and progress in January 2022. The grey is the intersections, the blue is health, and the red is climate change. And what you can see is construction and materials, lots of climate change, lots of health, understandably, lots of climate change, not a lot of intersection. Again, healthcare and equipment services, you would think they would care about the overlaps. Again, not that much in comms. And then real estate, which is probably where a lot of us spend our time. Again, not a lot in terms of the actual intersection. I genuinely believe that you can't understand the impacts of climate change without making it personal. I think health is probably the most personal thing to all of us. And probably most importantly, I would probably say that the next generation. So that is a scan of my son. He's 6 months old now, so he only looks marginally different from that. But I genuinely think that, and it's a big driver of my work and what I do, that we are custodians and stewards of the built environment and our world more broadly. And I don't think we're doing a very good job of handing over something better than the way we received it. So those are my motivations. So the first principles, or the terms that we should think about, is to orientate us, urban sanitation movement of 1.0, because I'd say healthonomics is the second one, which was really led by Edwin Chadwick. Edwin Chadwick was, he's well known for the Poor Laws, which was basically the legislation and guidance, which basically said if you can't cover your debts or you can't work, then you had to go into, a poorhouse, and these poorhouses were hell on earth in a lot of ways. But one thing he noticed when the poorhouses were being built and populated was that there was a particular event that led to a loss of families, particularly women and their children, and opened a poorhouse, and it was the death of the breadwinner. Or more specifically, the unemployment of the breadwinner, which tended to lead to their death. So quite often, the man of the house would effectively, his economic standing would degrade. He would turn to drink or crime or something similar. That's equally dangerous. He would either gamble, drink, generally pass away as a result of those activities, and that would leave the family that survives him in a poorhouse. And I would say that this is probably one of the first instances where the idea of economics, prosperity, health, and poverty kind of started to interplay. And it's one of the things that he was looking at when he commissioned the 1848 Public Health Act, or the report which led to the 1848 Public Health Act. So he's well known for the poor laws and poor houses, but his legacy is really the Public Health Act, which went on to become effectively the foundation upon which almost all public health legislation in the entire world was based. So he did something to redeem his reputation, I'd say. What's not reported as often as a driver for one of the reasons why HMG at the time entertained the idea of placing great large sewers under every single house and street and toilets and things like that was because they were afraid that the conditions which were occurring in cities could lead to something like the French Revolution, which happened 50 years prior in France. So they had they had some of the economic logic, they had some of the health logic, they had obviously at the time ideas around how a Christian nation should treat its people. But they did also have in the back of their mind that when people are desperate and destitute enough, they have a tendency to overthrow their governments. So pragmatic as our government always is, that's one of the things they went for. And so we ended up with Bazalgette's sewage system, which was absolutely fantastic. It was very frustrating for him. He dealt with NIMBYs and everything. You know, anyone who's built anything knows he went through the same things, even with a mandate from government at the time, and virtually eliminated cholera in the process because it was a closed sewer system. And again, this was a precedent on which many other systems throughout the world were based. And we're standing just over one now, I imagine. So modern day, we're in a place now where sewers aren't as controversial, but they're a lot more expensive. This one is a 15-mile sewer, which is running under London's 4.5 billion pounds. Super sewer, they call it, which I think is kind of cool, considering what it is. And we've made huge amounts of progress, but we still have a lot to do. So where are we now? Something I call all creek, no paddle. I would say this is the vicious cycle that we're in. The vicious cycle basically goes something like unhealthy cities lead to unhealthy people. When people are unhealthy, they're less productive. And when they're less productive, you end up with decelerating economic growth, which tends to make it very expensive to make cities healthy for people. And so the goal is to reverse that flow. The challenges we're dealing with, so cities produce something like 85% of global GDP. That's actually ticked up since I wrote the book, the additional 5%, which kind of proves my point. Value of pretty much 90.1 trillion. That's obviously net, because GDP is a net calculation. But they're facing a barrage of challenges. So we've also got climate change. This is an image from the Palisades fire in Los Angeles, and they're still having trouble in Los Angeles. They're setting stuff on fire as we speak. And the calculation from the Potsdam Institute, which is a German think tank, basically estimates that climate change could cost the global economy something like $38 trillion, which would be something like 35% of global GDP every year by 2050. So I'm not convinced we have the money to pay for that. We obviously have COVID recovery, so we're in a situation where I think it's Cambridge, which estimates that COVID cost the global economy something like $82 trillion over 5 years, which, and in the UK it was 310 to 410 billion. So if you're familiar with our current gearing as a country, we're geared almost as highly, if not more highly, than we were after the Second World War, by proportion. So if you're looking to benchmark where we are, so we're dealing with that. So when I say that, and I will say that later, when cities don't have money, it's because virtually no one has money. A point which I make in the book, which I talk in more detail. Is that we're probably at 100% debt to GDP in terms of sovereign debt as well. So pretty much every government in aggregate is in a place where their debt is higher than their income. So negative money, which isn't good. We obviously have aging populations and declining fertility. That plays two roles, both in the economic picture, which is fewer people, but also in the healthcare picture, which is fewer receipts from the working population to support healthcare activities. The NHS and similar causes a great deal of strain. We have climate migration, which we aren't seeing as much of yet, but I'm confident we will see it. My overwhelming fear, and one of the things that drives me, is I'm not convinced that our cities as they currently are built can deal with a large influx of climate migrants and climate refugees. I think it's something that we're going to see more of probably in the next 5 to 10 years. And I'm pretty confident as I get into the next chapter, you'll see one of the drivers is just going to be it's not feasible to live in some of the places where we live at the moment. You obviously have AI and mass unemployment, so I think the CEO of Anthropic believes that within the next 5 to 10 years we could lose something like 50% of graduate level jobs, which is obviously one of the key ways that we drive social mobility and also the spread of wealth and economic activity and opportunity and things like that. He's estimating 10 to 20% unemployment, which is huge. Generally in the West, you're looking at unemployment as being not more than single digits. So seeing something like 20% is pretty apocalyptic. And then you have just the very real fact that cities for the most part are insolvent. So in the UK, we're looking at between 4 in 10 expecting to fail within the next 5 to 10 years. I'm sure interventions will happen beforehand, but they aren't confident about their finances as they stand at the moment. And then in the US, you're looking at 70% of the largest cities are running deficits. So I think New York is running a deficit of something like 170 billion. What's not reported is how much of that is actually attributed to pension commitments made to public sector workers. So there isn't really a way for them to legally get around that apart from to make more money than to spend. We'll see how they get. So this is how I got to this simplification of what is a multi-headed problem and what do I feel is the solution. So slight detours here, but bear with me. So urban sanitation 2.0, which I believe could be sort of Moore's law for healthy cities. If you're familiar with tech at all, Moore's law is basically the observation that the number of transistors in integrated circuits or chips will double every 2 years. That was said or observed by Gordon Moore. He was co-founder of Fairchild Semiconductor and also co-founder of Intel as well. And it's named for him. It's not so much a law as an observation. And it turns out he was right and his observation was accurate. If anything, it was more fast and more intense than was predicted. So what you're seeing here is the number of transistors on microchips, and they've doubled every 2 years, pretty much as he expected. The net effect of that had really profound implications. What that really meant in practice was that for decades, computers and computing became 2 times more powerful and 2 times cheaper virtually every 2 years. You'll feel this if you have older laptops. After about 2 years, they start to get a bit slow and you're like, why isn't this as good as the other ones? That's partially why age and also the new chips coming out are much, much better. Useful if you're trying to sell computers, I have to say. And what this meant was that increasingly higher performance computing was accessible to more and more people over time. Obviously, it started at the enterprise level with businesses, and then eventually, we're in a place now where the phone in your pocket is something like 140,000 times more powerful than what we sent the Apollo astronauts up in the moon in. The other interesting aspect is effectively what happened is there's this concept called Jevons paradox, which is named after an English economist called William Jevon. And it's called Jevons paradox because before they discovered it, and you see it quite often, there's this idea that when it becomes cheaper to sell something, that you'll make less money from it. The goal is sometimes to sell your goods for the highest price you can get. But when the fundamental structure of that good becomes half or a necessarily sufficiently large enough amount cheaper, you actually end up making considerably more money because it increases the total addressable market of that good. And that's what Jevons paradox is. And so what I'm proposing is, can we, as it happened with the chips, can we do the same for cities? Because the fundamental principle is that better and cheaper leads to more demand, larger markets, which leads to explosive growth, and that is a recursive relationship. So it keeps accelerating as the explosive growth, it funds better and cheaper goods, which increases demand. The opposite is also true. Worse and more expensive goods leads to less demand, which ultimately leads to contraction in any market. And I feel it's where we kind of are with cities, but they are being buoyed by imbalances, significant imbalances in supply and demand with regard to stock and housing. So we're here, I reject this, and I think that we can get to something which looks more like this, which is healthy cities, and by healthy I mean better, more enjoyable places that will produce healthier people, and healthier people enjoy it will lead to accelerating economic growth. Those returns and those receipts can be reinvested into cities, and those cities can attract more and more people. So we need to try and reverse that and get to a place where we are welcoming more people, they're increasingly happier, and that leads to a sort of super attractor effect within the cities that we care about. I think we can get there. I don't think we're that far. People love cities as they are. They would love them if they were even better. So how we reverse this? So the overview is, as I said, I can't present the whole book, but I can give you something of an overview. The book is incredibly long. So I'll go through some like an intro, which I've just done. There are 7 chapters in the book, which is quite good, lucky number 7. And if you're really lazy, there is a TLDR, and TLDR stands for too long didn't read, at the back of the book, and it just has all the solutions. So you can just skip all of my hard work and just go to where all the value is if you're interested in, and jump backwards and forwards if it's of interest to you. 7 chapters which I'll roll through. Throwing Shade, which is about urban overheating. That's what we'll focus on later. Invisible Killer, which is about air pollution. The Natural Health Service, which is green space and biodiversity. Housing as a Vaccine. This is one of my favourite images. I call this almost like the YIMBY chapter because it says on that sign, stop the old golf course / X tip from being developed. It's an old golf course and it's an X-tip. I'm not sure why you'd want to preserve it, but this is where we are. BDSM, not as naughty as it sounds. It's about bikes and how they do so much for cities, walkability and mobility. Alienation and participation, which is about loneliness and the soft power of cities. So that's really about how when you buttress the identity of a place, you're able to draw people out because you give them something in common to relate to each other about. So it was a really interesting one. I mentioned Peaky Blinders in it quite a bit. So if you like Peaky Blinders, that might be the chapter for you. And then Urban Machines, which is about urban infrastructure, power and plumbing, effectively, so water and things like that. Really critical if you're interested in the development of AI and these advanced technologies, because we don't have anything like the grid capacity to be able to properly integrate them into the economy. So that's the overview, all 7 chapters. And the chapter structure basically goes something like, I do a sort of micro meta-analysis. It's not proper meta-analysis because it's not purely statistical. My father is a statistician, so he wanted me to make that clear. I basically go through health impacts in biology, and then I move through into what the economic costs are. There are some overlaps, but they're relatively distinct. And then I move into data-led solutions, and I make a point of breaking the solutions down by different stakeholder groups. So if you're a normal person, there's guidance for you. If you're a professional, so you're an architect or engineer, there's guidance for you. If you're a developer, not to say developers aren't professionals, but if you're a developer, there's a section for you as well, and that draws on my experience. Policymakers, there's strong recommendations in there because they, in many ways, are the backstop for a lot of this. And then there's something called Requests for Startups, which I call techno-urbanist companies. And the reason that's in there is because I believe that a lot of these problems can't be solved in the standard business models that we have today. I think we need separate companies to use new technologies to attack specific problems. And there is an example at the end of this. So throwing shade and health impacts of urban overheating. My argument is that we spend a lot of time when we talk about climate change talking about carbon surplus, carbon emissions, but it's just too abstract for people, and to be quite honest, it's too late. We are now in a place where if we follow all current policies, we are going to way overshoot the 1.5 target that we'd set for ourselves, and we're really looking at 2.7 to 3.1 territory. If we manage to execute on the things that we have said, a lot of pledges and targets, and these are things that we're doing to specifically get to 1.5 but fail, we'll still be at 2.4. So what that means is that a much warmer and more volatile climate is locked in and guaranteed. Even if we were to change direction now, there is still an inertia within the climate such that it will still take maybe half a century for us to effectively start to reverse challenge. So my position is we need to prepare for this future reality, and carbon isn't really going to cut it. Cutting carbon isn't going to cut it. I should have put that in the book. Cities are feeling it first. So cities are feeling it first. This is a heat map of New York, and cities are feeling it first because of something called the urban heat island effect, which was first observed by Luke Howard. So again, Londoner blue plaque, and he developed the nomenclature for cloud systems. So Cirrus, etc. He named them. That's why he's called name of clouds, which is a cool name. And he basically observed that the countryside was much cooler than the centre of London at the time, and this was in the 1810s. It's much warmer now, to the point that it's easily 10 degrees warmer inside of a major city than it is within the rural hinterlands around it. These are some images which help you demonstrate. So we have satellite images, and obviously the red is showing heat, hotter, and the blue is showing cooler. And you can see the green areas are much cooler than the red areas as they're focused, where you have more tarmac, when you have more built elements. And part of the reason for that is because built elements, so your bricks, your tarmac or asphalt, as the Americans would say, it all absorbs heat, and then it has a tendency to just irradiate it as well. Whereas green areas tend to disperse the heat through what's known as transpiration, which is the evaporation of the water within the plants. So for most cities, by 2050, it's going to feel like they've been transported about 600 miles closer to the equator. So this is from some research done by Jean-Francois Bastin and his team, and it basically shows that, at least for London, it's going to feel probably by 2050 a lot more like Barcelona. Which sounds good, and we will get to why it's not. So no fun is allowed, and that's by 2050. So in terms of that graph, in terms of timing, pretty much, I mean, rather annoyingly, it looks like we're at the crest of the maximum temperature within the current policies projections. So it won't be good. And annoyingly, overheating in the countryside also affects cities. So we're in a place now where we have frequent wildfires. So this is from the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Centre, who are really nice. They gave me permission to use this. And this is what happened in 2023. So way over what was expected. They were stretched in a way that they couldn't predict, and it was so vast and so intense that it compromised the air quality in New York, which was 2,000 kilometers away. So a long way away. So we're in this place now where cities aren't islands in the way that they function. They are connected to their hinterlands, and maybe even to a hinterland in another country if there are wildfires, and that's why it's worth us paying attention to it. The smoke was so significant that it cooled the temperature of New York by 3 degrees, and this was in summer at the time, so this was June. San Francisco, again, they had significant wildfires, so much so that it changed the colour of the sky. Orange, this was in 2020, and it didn't really help the mental health of the people who were in lockdown, seeing what looked like the apocalypse on their doorstep. And one of the reasons, apart from the materials and things, one of the reasons this happened is because in cities, heat rises, the air becomes stagnant, and the sunlight leads to increased ozone production, which is something about biological materials in the air. interestingly, buildings which are over 66 meters tend to have ground floors which are much warmer. So I'll come to one of my solutions, I think, for that. But that was probably a really interesting thing for me to discover, that there was a relationship between contribution to the urban heat island effect and the overall height of a tall building. Because density is good, but there is clearly a point where density starts to become something that we need to manage with regard to the additional effects that it has on the cities and places around it. So the trouble really starts, I mean, apart from the noxious air pollution, but the trouble really starts when the wildfires move into cities. So this was London, heatwave July 2022, and what you can see is that a lot of the fire, at least for these homes, had migrated from beyond their backyards, their back gardens, into the homes. All of the green space in front is pretty much dehydrated turf and grass which caught fire. The house in the top right corner is pretty much gone. There were 2,400 emergency calls, 740 grass fires, and that was a predominant driver for a lot of the calls. Almost 3,000 excess deaths directly attributed to the wildfires, which were a direct result of the overheating. And it was such a significant event, and they've written reports about it, that the London Fire Service had to call members of staff who were not working at the time. And even when they did that, there was something like 14 fire trucks they weren't able to use because there weren't enough members of staff to operate them. So we're in a place now where the events which are occurring are far outside the capacity that we've budgeted for, both in terms of manpower, resources, and even strategic planning. So you could say, well, the best thing to do is not live close to green space. It's probably not going to happen, but also really green space is a really, really positive thing for your property and your health more broadly. So proximity to green space, and here, this is percentage increase of your property relative to the size of the green space. So the larger it is, the more of a bump you get in your house price, which is positive. I think we intuitively understand that, but it's nice to see the data for it. Drops off relatively quickly after about 25 meters, and then just continues to drop off. So the closer you are to green space, generally, the higher the house price you enjoy for the most part, and the fact that you're 24% more likely to meet your exercise targets as well. So these are NHS exercise targets. So but you do have to be more vigilant. So there's a trade-off there. And to top it all off, higher temperatures also worsen air pollution, which is a problem almost everywhere. So this is effectively a diagram which I rather painfully recreated. It took ages. And what you see is the green line is really where we should be, and descending from worst to best. These are capital cities, from worst to best, how well these cities are performing, and you can see the vast majority aren't performing well. Even my favourite, Tokyo, which tends to knock everything out of the park, isn't performing particularly well with regard to air quality. So if all of these cities get warmer, the health starts to degrade of the people in those places. Air pollution, for the most part, comes from a few places, but for the most part, it comes from road transport, so cars and similar. Some biomass and wood boiling, but that's a lot less. Commercial cooking surprised me as a source for air pollution, but it makes sense. Construction is relatively low, but obviously, the more construction you have, the more air pollution. Power and industrial processes, as you'd expect, and then you start to climb down the scale, with rail being the superstar in terms of air pollution. So trams are a good thing. Your air pollution, for the most part, is composed of lots of different things, but what I've got here is six of the main components. And when it's really, really warm, this is the percentage difference in intensity of the air pollution, or these pollutants particularly. So you're looking at a 17% increase, which I mentioned about ozone and sunlight. You have a 7%, or almost 8% in terms of PM2N. So the PMs are particularly worth paying attention to, and they're something that is commonly tracked as a proxy for air pollution in general, and it stands for particulate matter and its particular size. So Particulate matter 2.5 is 2.5 microns small, and particulate matter 10 is 10 microns large, effectively, still not large. 2.5 is the most important because it's the one that can be lodged in our lungs and in our blood systems. And if you have too much of it, then it can start to lead to things like this. So what you have is different ages of different kinds of lungs. A lot of these conditions are irreversible, and it really is very simply the buildup of the particulate matter within the lungs. That's what you're seeing there. The DNA damage refers to the fact that if you are hoping to have children, there are suspicions that it does compromise the quality of the DNA within the sperm, particularly, not so much for the egg, but for the sperm, but it takes two to tango. And then just general systemic inflammation within the body, which also opens the body up for lots of other more serious health conditions as well. So it is really the risk factor of risk factors for most things, and we're all subjected to it. Affects us in different points of our life, but in aggregate, virtually all of our lives from pre-birth, so before you're born, they found particulate matter on the fetus's side of the placenta, which means that, you know, pollution is affecting unborn children. It can lead to low birth weight in particularly polluted cities. From childhood, you're looking at asthma, slow lung development, and brain development. And that is interesting because it affects young boys, more than it affects young girls. So a study done, I think, in Brazil basically found that the air pollution was leading to the boys underperforming in their exams relative to the girls. The girls did better. Probably not a trophy you want to win, but yeah, it's something. And then as you move into adulthood, you start to have problems with sometimes diabetes. Obviously, lung cancer would be a big problem, and then fertility issues as well. And then in old age, depending on where you've lived and the sort of lifestyle you've had, a lot of that pollution can basically crescendo into much more significant and serious issues such as sclerosis, obviously lung cancer, diabetes, and I'll explain later why respiratory illnesses, which also give you an additional risk when your city heats up. So heat waves lead to increased mortality. Depending on geography, you can basically see an uptick of between 7.6 and 33.6 in terms of mortality when a heat wave occurs. And rather painfully, if you're a woman who's over the age of 75 and you have respiratory problems, then you're much more likely to suffer from when it gets really, really warm, which is a shame. In 2022, again, it was a bumper year. 60,000 people in Europe died as a direct result of the heat wave. Again, an outlier. Well, we would hope it's an outlier, but I think it's still in trend relative to 2015 to 2020 to 2021. That was the average of the mortalities during heat waves and summer period, and it far exceeds that. So there's a chance that we're going to see more and more of that, and that could become a norm. I hope it isn't, but you know, we need to prepare. If you do survive, then your mental health may suffer as well, which is a shame. So a UK study found a 3.8% increase in suicide rates for every 1 degree over 18 degrees C. And there are a few reasons why that happens. They found similar results in the USA and Mexico, and there are a few reasons why that happens. So if you are taking medication for antidepressant or antipsychotic medicines, it has a tendency to disrupt your temperature regulation, which I wasn't aware of. They believe it might have something to do sometimes with the amount of lithium that's present as well. So what that means in practice is you don't feel as hot as you might be, and that can lead to you effectively underestimating the precautions and steps you need to take. And interestingly, people with schizophrenia are also disproportionately vulnerable during heat waves because the condition disrupts your ability to thermally regulate and perceive heat as well. So you have some scenarios where people who are in health institutions are wrapped up in blankets when it's really, really warm outside because they're just not able to tell. I think if I remember correctly, they can sometimes track whether the condition is improving because they're able to thermally regulate better. So it's a strange, underreported scenario. So the economic costs are significant. This again is the Palisades fire from 2025, so earlier this year, estimated to cost between $25 and $39 billion. It was a particularly affluent area, and that's part of the reason that number's so high. But even in that area with all of the swimming pools, they weren't necessarily safe. Got 5 minutes?
Yes.
You're the fastest talking you've ever seen. Okay. And so the estimation is it cost us 16 trillion, which is about 484 billion per year, and that's since the 1990s, which is significant as a global number. Specifically zooming in on Europe, you're looking at 85 billion cost per year, which is about the same. It's about 30% of the EU defence budget as it stands at the moment. So that's probably 30% more we could be spending to protect us from Russia. Four main areas which are affected by the overheating: your energy infrastructure, physical infrastructure, your health costs, and your productivity losses. I'll speed through these and we can pick it up on questions, but I'll go through each slide. So the expectation is that heat demand is going to go through the roof, and that's going to put strain on the grid. It's so predictable that Citadel, who are in London Wall, and their head of weather, who's Dr. Nicholas Klingerman, are able to basically take a position on commodities based on the way the weather is. They're very good. I think they're very good at looking at forecasts which are sort of 2 months ahead, which is a incredibly difficult thing to do. But they are of the mind, even if you're a climate skeptic, they are of the mind that we are looking at increasingly volatile weather conditions, which are opportunities for them to make money. They make money. I don't think we really make as much. It tends to cost us a lot more. And one of the reasons for that is because the heat compromises the performance of the grid. This is your typical loss of your grid at the different stages. Obviously, stepping down and stepping up, expected losses. Transmission lines are a big one because the lines get longer and they're metal, so they're not ready. And you've got distribution cables. And the grid is looking at increased losses between 2% and 6%. Per capita summertime energy demand increasing by between 4% and 15%. Renewables and grid volatility. So we had a scenario in Spain and Portugal where they had a 10-hour blackout. They're not sure precisely what caused that, but their two choices are unusual temperature with regard to the weather and increasing renewables. And I would say they're probably not different things, because when it's really sunny, you have more generation from renewables, and that can lead to disturbances and inertia in the grid. Our grids are really old. The UK's grid is about 90 years old. Most grids are between 40 and 50 years old. You have lots of new tech demand. So the estimation is that we'll need like 19,000 terawatt hours, which is the equivalent of building 2 Chinese energy grids by 2050. You have grid upgrade costs to deal with increased renewables. And you've also got the fact that the climate change that we will eventually start to see just starts to push our infrastructure, including the grid, into different places. So this is in Hammersmith, where they had to wrap certain parts of the bridge because the design, kind of the thermal design of metal structures are based on the expected climate in which you would build them in. So the UK isn't as warm as, say, somewhere like Spain, where they would have anticipated increased elevated temperatures, but we have a lot of infrastructure in the UK which is metal, and our average annual increase in temperature is accelerating. And so we're going to need to do much more remedial works in that respect. This is in India, where the road literally melted. It's a cool effect. And then this is in Georgia in the USA, where the road, made of different materials and different levels, responds to the heat at different rates, contraction and expansion, and it led to the road buckling. We haven't seen that in the UK. Might be the way that we construct things, but we're in a place where we're looking at anticipated budget increases relative to where we're expecting climate change to really hit in terms of temperatures. So we're tracking towards between 2 and 3, and you can see that there is a significant difference. There's almost a doubling of the anticipated increase in budget when you go from 2 degrees to 3 degrees. Hospitalizations, we're expecting significant increases to the order of 58%, depending on who you're talking to. And in the US, they're expecting significant uptick in admissions as well as emergency room visits and just general annual expenditure. In the UK, it's costing us in heat waves between 260 and 300 million per year. And this is one of my favourite bits. I'll do this bit and then I'll speak towards the end. So Lee Kuan Yew, who was the first Prime Minister of Singapore, said two things I really liked. The first thing he said when he was at Cambridge was that the English are mad because they were supposed to go rowing when there was a snowstorm. He didn't show up and was told off, and he didn't like that. The second thing he said was that he credits air conditioning as well as tolerance. But air conditioning is one of the reasons why they were able to increase their GDP by something like 100-fold over the last sort of 30, 40 years. And I think we're going to be seeing similar challenges. We can learn a lot from Singapore. Economically, we're going to be seeing increasingly high levels of inflation around costs with regard to logistics, manufacturing, and the service sector because of outputs in AC and disruption. And then we get to some of the solutions. So this is a cool one. So a solution they have in Japan is they stick fans on their jackets. And it can last for 8 to 11 hours. So if you're not familiar with Japan, very humid climate, very, very warm in summer. Again, in Tokyo, because of urban heat island effect, it's warming up faster. And this is one of the solutions they've come to. You're looking at between 20 and 120 pounds, so really affordable cooling, particularly for workers who work outside. There's urban misting, or misting, which I kind of see as an abstraction of the Japanese tradition of uchimitsu, which is spreading cold water and allowing it to evaporate and cool the air around you. It's a really cool practice. They do it every year. Decent costs around how much it costs to maintain, but it's something that you'd have to something you would have to deal with at an urban level. But if you have real estate or you have gardens or estates, it's something to look at. External awnings are a very good idea, and they're much cheaper than trees. Building buildings close together is a good idea because you can fit more plots on a site, which is positive, as long as you pay proper attention to refuse and fire regulations. If you increase the amount of greenery, that can decrease your thermal temperature within cities by around 1 to 4 degrees, or about 10%. And the cost to maintain that is decreasing as AI gets smarter as well. So AI can cut it for you. That's back. Aperture treatment, so shading, this is relatively self-explanatory. Thermal mass, again, very self-explanatory, but you need to pay attention to purge ventilation because that's the way you release the heat from a thermal mass. Placing more value on northern aspects. So in this country, we place a lot of value on southern aspects because that's where the sun is coming in. The market is increasingly starting to look north as a result of this. Reflected panels on your solar panels, as well as cooling, can lead to increased outputs of something like 20% from your PV, which helps with your payback periods, and also generates something like 26 jobs, if you're talking about residential, per megawatt of install, which is really, really powerful. District urban cooling, again, relatively self-explanatory. This is King's Cross, and that's where they're using it there, and can be very good for developers because you gain more space on your roof. It's more efficient as well, less emissions. This is a reality of having 66 meter high buildings. After that point, you can start to look at directing the wind downwards to move air. And then I believe that every building should have an underwater water tank for emergencies because we'll need it. And my request for startup is there's a Swedish expression, which I won't say and butcher, but it basically reads that there's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing. I believe that's going to be the case when it gets really warm. Elite athletes, so race car drivers, football players, use what's known as PCM clothing, or phase change material clothing, and what it is, it absorbs heat from the body and uses that to change state. I don't see why we can't combine the two together, and we can't have snazzy jackets with PCM in. I think it would work. I'd certainly buy one. And that's a still from the film about the guy who fell in love with his AI called Her. Thank you.
systems change is happening, but arguably not nearly fast enough. And I've done a lot of research recently into generative AI for good, for social impact, being used in urban planning. And also a lot of municipalities around the world, from Singapore to Tampere in Finland and so on, are absolutely, and Barcelona, other cities, are in the avant-garde in terms of all their tracking and monitoring systems using generative AI and digital twins to be ahead of the game in terms of predicting when there's going to be flash flooding and all the rest of it. I mean, it's such a big topic, and obviously you're an entrepreneur, so you have huge passionate faith, biblical faith almost, in the power of entrepreneurialism to help solve these things. But do you think that, I mean, local authorities are very beleaguered right now, but who do you think are going to be the most powerful forces to help progress urban healthonomics? Or is it a question of basically, if we can all pull together, then we will have a bit of a stronger chance? Because it can't always and only be about the kind of jacket that you wear to, I mean, say just take the heat island effects and so on. There are specific things that landscape architects can do to mitigate that. But it's literally, our code of conduct should be literally very full on from this point in order to not miss a trick.
Yeah, so I think that I talk about silos a lot, and that's why I give solutions by different stakeholders. But my second aim with doing that was to make sure that the stakeholders could see what other stakeholders could do, so they could hold them to account. So I think cross-pollination is one of the ways we'll get there. I believe that cities, for the most part, they're effectively an aggregation of much smaller projects. It's a series of buildings, places, master plans, blah, 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 blah. And within all of those scenarios, there is an opportunity for the team that's present to do their bit to deal with the particular challenge that we're talking about, whether it be urban overheating or biodiversity or something else. I do believe that they have a great role to play. And my hope with the book and why I wrote the TLDR section was so that not only could all of the teams be on the same page, but also so that those who were minded to try and think about some of these challenges would have the economic arguments. So I don't go into it so much in the presentation, but I do in certain instances break down, at least based on my research, the cost of doing particular things. So we talk about landscaping. A really powerful thing you can do with landscaping is, as well as increasing how much there is and looking at species which are drought resistant, and looking at species which are evergreen as well. The other thing that you can do is you can start to take a three-dimensional approach. So one thing I propose is that you can create external rooms or defensible edges around developments, because that's one of the key ways that you can start to manage the quality of the air within a development without effectively having really large fans on all the time. So I think individual teams have their role to play, and they should be cross-pollinating as they work through projects. But I genuinely, which is why I have the request for startup section, I believe that we do need new and different kinds of companies to deal with particular challenges, because a lot of the roles we're in the worshipful company of architects. It's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. The method of practice hasn't changed that much, perhaps around the edges with the tools that we use, but the role is really clearly defined. And I think it's only by having outliers or people who aren't within that system, but understand and respect it, to be able to give sometimes an excuse or support for the existing practitioners to be able to think differently and do differently.
Definitely. I mean, you could track a whole load of positive phenomena. I mean, the world now, municipalities have way more climate resilience officers, don't they?
Yeah.
I mean, Medellin in Colombia is one brilliant example. I think what they're doing at the GLA, obviously, you know, Sadiq Khan, the mayor, wrote a whole book about overcoming air pollution based on his personal history. But it's just a momentous scale of work that has to be done.
Yeah.
But so the piece about, we'll open it up for the audience in a sec, but I just quickly want to ask you, the piece about supporting the economic health of cities is more of a nuanced one to draw out from, unless do you spell it out in the final section of the book?
Yeah, I do.
I mean, obviously one can see there are a hell of a lot of savings that can be made if you put all your incredible proposals together.
Yeah, so the way that you end up increasing the prosperity of cities is at project level. It's making the project more economically successful. Because like I said, a city is basically an aggregation of smaller projects. So if all of those projects are more successful in the period where they take place, then ultimately that city will be more successful, or the companies which operate within that city should be more successful. At a larger scale, there are two things that municipalities need to do. They need to enable and get out of the way and allow for the practitioners to do what they need to do. And the other thing they need to do is they need to be more entrepreneurial in the way that they see these challenges. So they need to be thinking not, oh, it's going to get really warm, therefore we should force all the developers to put, I don't know, sun awnings everywhere or whatever it is, or push the responsibility on them. They should be thinking more like, well, if it's really, really warm outside, we might be in a situation, I think in the City of London, they're really hot on it as well. We might be in a situation where people will avoid being outside for long periods of time. That has real knock-on effects for ground plane retail. And so what we should be doing is helping and working with ground plane retail to install misting systems, install awnings, install greenery, so that it starts to become a destination that you go outside and into, similar to hot countries, and go and sit outside and maybe enjoy the heat.
Yeah, behavioural change, really.
Precisely, but it has to be enabled through infrastructure and intent and policy as well.
Timely, this week in the City of London, the City of London plan for 2040 is being examined, and on Wednesday the examination is on tall buildings, and the city, on the whole, builds a lot of, or gives planning consent to a lot of tall buildings very close together. I wonder what message you might have for that meeting on Wednesday.
Building tall buildings is generally good, is a positive thing. They will, and I've designed my own share of tall buildings, they will be aware of the nature of the ground plane. But what I would suggest to them is they need to think about the future condition of the ground plane. So tall buildings occupiers really, they're kind of like temporally confused because they can take up to 3 years to design, and then they can take between 3 and 5 years to build. So what that means is at any one point in time, they're either trailing or ahead of a significant portion of time. It takes you 5 years to build, it's about half a decade. So what that means if they start building now, we're talking about 2035. I would say think about and model the climate in 2035 and maybe even in 2050, because everything that they're doing with regard to the design of their chemical adhesives, to mechanical ventilation, to understanding how heat movement occurs at the ground plane and similar, all of those things will be markedly different in 2035 and in 2050. I think good engineers are already forward forecasting, but it's hard to, if you're an engineer, it will be challenging to say we should spend 12% more on HVAC because it's going to be much hotter in 25 years. It's hard to make that case, or it can be hard to make that case if the client is an investor who takes a really long view, so they're not just looking to stabilize and exit after 2 or 3 years, then they will be interested in that. But it's up to the professionals to raise it, because investors, to be honest, have a lot on their plate anyway. And they are making a bet that this asset will be productive in 20 years, 30 years. And it's our job to make sure that it's still the case.
I'd like to zoom way out now, away from HVAC and the technology and infrastructure to your driving framework for the book, and it was that sort of triangular of healthy cities, healthy people, and economic growth, and obviously the reverse can play out too. And I'd like to focus on the healthy people and then drill down into what do you do when you have an unequal distribution of those healthy people. So to point to here in London, often people will recognize the map of the district line where from east to west you have a life expectancy variation of, depending on the year, most recently between 20 and 30 years, which is pretty incredible. So I guess my question then is, first of all, do you believe that health inequality of that severity will also impact the economic growth that you talk about? And if you do, how do you think your framework can address that? And it doesn't come back down to the micro level of individual interventions on either on the policy development, design, or startup framework, or is it something else?
So I do believe that there will be an interplay between inequality and the health outcomes. Because you're talking about most people and we have a nationalised health service, then the net effect is the more people who are unhealthy, the more expensive our national insurance is. So even if you are wealthier, you're still going to feel it in your pocket if more and more people suffer from increased temperatures and air pollution and similar. So it is a factor in the book. It's something I mentioned that people in low-income areas deal with disproportionate amounts of air pollution, disproportionate amounts of overheating, they have poorer diets, they have less access to green space, etc., etc. Everything that you would want, they have much less of. And I would say that healthonomics is, I think it's an economic justification for dealing with those problems ahead of time, rather than dealing with the aftermath, because the aftermath would be much worse and much more expensive. What's the second part of your question?
Just about how your framework does address this, and you've answered part of that. But do you think that London is particularly unusual, or do you think that's just endemic to most of the Western cities you've?
Oh, it's endemic. It's the same. I mean, if you look at just, one of the reasons. So this book was originally called Parkonomics, because I believed that the full economic picture of parks wasn't being appreciated. My basic understanding at the time was, quite often, particularly in developments, we'll say something like, we need to maximise the rentable floor area, NSA, or whatever it is, and therefore we can't afford to have green space, etc., etc. But or a local authority will say it's too expensive to maintain the green space. But if you factor in the role that green space plays in terms of cooling, in terms of mental health, in terms of exercise, and the fact that a lot of conditions are downstream from having a sedentary lifestyle, and green space specifically targets that, then you would actually start to see the green space as incredibly affordable compared to the alternative. So yeah, I think as an approach, I think it's the right approach for everybody. And probably the last point I would probably make is that there aren't, one of the things, so when the vicious cycle, one of the things that meaningfully degrades our enjoyment and productivity and experience of cities is disproportionate amounts of suffering of other people. So whether it be homelessness, whether it be crime as a result of lower incomes, whether it be increased hospitalizations, air pollution, even if you are sufficiently comfortable, your experience of that city degrades. And so we kind of are all in it together, whether we always feel that way or not, which is why I don't make a distinction at the diagram level as to who the people are, because we all benefit when our cities are healthy and more prosperous.
Have you sent a copy to the mayor?
No, I haven't. No, not
I
yet.
suggest you do that tomorrow morning.
Challenge you a bit, if you don't mind.
Please.
So, would it be too crude to sort of paraphrase what you were saying by summarising as we're heading for 3 degrees, so we better learn to mitigate for that. Is that too
Not-
crude?
Not just mitigate, but it makes, I mean, I think the Treasury has basically said that preparing for the effects of climate change now it'll basically become twice as expensive to do so when it starts to hit.
Okay, so I feel that there's two quite big gaps in what you presented so far. Maybe it's in the book, but I didn't hear you challenging the economic system, the current economic system, in any particular depth. I also didn't hear you talk about planetary health, which is the idea that our health and well-being as humans is inseparable from the well-being of the living systems on which we depend for the essentials of life. And the reason I think both of those need to be discussed is because we really need to understand what 3 degrees means. Yes, we are heading for 3 degrees, but that's a global average. And that means about 5 degrees on land and about 8 degrees in cities. If we let 3 degrees happen, vast areas of the tropical world, the poorest parts of the world, will be completely uninhabitable.
Correct.
And even with mass deployment of air conditioning, we'll still see mass collapse of ecosystems and food systems. And that's why I think we really have to be questioning the current economic system very profoundly and questioning the idea of growth. Because you were suggesting that with healthonomics we can have continued growth. But with what is regarded as a healthy level of growth by economists of say 3% per year, that would double the size of the economy in under 25 years. And we know that that's not sustainable. But at the moment, no one in politics or the media seems to have the courage to challenge endless growth, or let alone talk about degrowth. And I feel we really ought to be talking about what kind of growth we want. You know, do we want the kind of growth that improves our well-being and biodiversity and soil health and children's education and so on? And surely we should be degrowing the things that are trashing the future. Private jets, diamond-encrusted handbags, all that kind of stuff. But that debate just doesn't seem to be happening. No one seems to have the courage in politics to raise it.
So if I remember correctly, planetary health is in the book. I wrote an entire chapter, rather painfully, about food systems, but I ended up cutting it because it was hard within the framework of the book for it to be relatable, it felt. But planetary health is in the book. It's under the Natural Health Service. Challenging the system. Oh, you mentioned climate migration. Yeah, I mentioned that. That's in there, and that's one of the drivers for it. In terms of challenging the system, yeah, I don't know. My personal feeling is we don't have time. We don't have time to try and reconstruct what's probably the most successful economic system that we've come up with. It's not the best, it's not perfect. And I also don't understand quite how one would go about doing that because we don't have a model for what right looks like. So we're dealing with lots of uncertainty. And at the same time, we have an economic system which has hundreds of years of empirical evidence with regard to how it performs, with regard to shocks, commodity prices, healthcare, migration, etc., etc. So I don't think that we should necessarily change the system. There are probably changes within the system that we could do, but I don't have a view on what an alternative should be. I would probably say that the relationship between the kind of growth we want is effectively what I'm outlining in the book. It's a growth which is driven by people getting more of what they want and more of what they need, as opposed to a growth which is purely numerical or fiscal. I think we're waking up, at least in this country, to the idea that you can have forms of growth which are sort of narrowly beneficial and not widely felt. I would say I'm very pro-growth, but I would probably say that I'm a big believer in building stuff. Probably you can guess from my background. And I think that the thing that we haven't done over the last 30 years is really build stuff. I think when you build stuff, you are able to embark on endeavours which materially improve people's lives. You obviously have the old cliche, the Keynesian idea that, you know, large public works is also a great way of employing people. But I think what's always lost in that articulation is that the secondary benefits of being economically active, such as being physically active, the development of skills, the absence of idleness, which is, you know, a factor which is involved in crime and things like that, the idea of respect, discipline, blah, 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 all sorts of old traditional things. But I think that what we need to do is do more building, and that, probably naively, I think will probably start to address some of the main challenges we have in our economy. Now, what we build, again, maps to how we deal with the climate. Like I said, I don't believe that we have the luxury anymore of building things and places which are based on last century's climate and expectations. I think we need to build for the climate that we're going to have if we want our cities to last for another 500 years or so. And I also think we need to build things which are designed to mitigate against those challenges. Like I said, I don't think cutting carbon is enough anymore. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but if you have to choose between a rail line, which will meaningfully increase the circulation of goods, people, services, economic value in the country, then that is more valuable than the carbon which would be saved by not doing it. Because not doing anything is the easiest way to save carbon, and that's not really a choice. So the question is what we do. I'd probably say this last thing, which is, I believe that the biggest actors, so India, China and the US, have no plans to decarbonise in a meaningful way, which is one of the reasons we're locked in. And I believe that we, as the UK, have a choice. We have a choice as to whether, when that long panoply of challenges which I listed hit, whether we have the economic strength to resist them, and we have the economic strength to be able to provide for people that we care for, particularly the most vulnerable, or we can continue to twiddle our thumbs and worry about arguably intellectual challenges which won't protect us from the outcomes of any of these challenges, and will leave us in a weak economic state when all of these things hit. I think we need to be aiming to be in a strong position by 2035, 2050. And I think if we're able to do that, then I can see a future where the UK is a relevant and strong country for the next 100 years or so. I think if we miss that, then my fear is we won't be that. And I think for a country like the UK, that's as proud as it is, I think the psychological shock of that will be, I think it will be profound on a level that I don't think we're really prepared for. We're starting to see some examples of what that shock might look like in terms of disruption and division and things like that. Nothing like what it will look like if we're talking about national droughts and economic decline. We need to deal with one of them. I think we need to be strong to deal with the other. I hope that's...
Martin, have you set up a group of opinion formers and influencers who you can discuss at high level with, you know, the power players in this field to, I mean, because one of the key points you've made is that it is incumbent on everyone to plan much further ahead. You know, have the foresight to imagine these scenarios rather than only next year or only 2030. And I mean, I'm convinced there are a lot of people out there here in this city who would like to engage with you. So
I'd like to engage with them.
have you got
However I
a
can.
group in formation as we speak?
I don't, no.
Okay.
Slightly busy, but I'd like one.
Or maybe the mayor always answers letters when you write to him, in my experience. So maybe you could put that proposition to him.
I've moved here from Los Angeles, and as you were presenting the scope of challenges and some of the solutions, it occurred to me that Los Angeles is doomed in every respect, because it has been functionally a drought for the last 15 to 20 years, with one winter exception 2 years ago, I think. Are there urban environments that are just doomed? Wait, oh my God, that is the saddest thing to end on. Where is the hope in these?
For every city you give that's doomed, give a city that's gonna kick ass.
Yes. Basically, I've never felt more grateful to move
Please,
to
let's
this
end
brilliant.
on a high note, shall we?
Are there cities which are effectively doomed? I'd say no. And the reason I'd say no is because we do have time. We don't have as much time as we'd like, but we do have time. And when I was writing the book, I made a specific choice to only pick what I call dumb solutions. And I think dumb solutions are the best. They're cheapest, they're easiest to adopt. And I think what matters is that they are honest about what they're going to be dealing with and what those fallout conditions are going to be. So for example, I think it was Detroit or similar. Okay, here's the other thing I'd say. There are also cities which are dealing with these challenges ahead of everybody else a lot sooner. And so what we can do is we can learn from what those cities are doing, which is what I do in the book, look from what those cities are doing and start to prepare for how we can handle it. So for example, I think it was in Detroit, but I could be wrong. And I know that they did in Canada, weirdly enough, when they had heat waves, they had centralized cooling centers. So they were basically, town halls and similar, where they just made everything cool. They gave people water. They had the AC up maximum, and they, in some instances, they had beds for people to sleep, because a lot of the challenge around overheating is when it doesn't cool down at night. That's when you start to have lots of other challenges with regard to mental health, etc., etc. So I would say, I wrote the book because I do think there's hope, and I was going to say I was severe, but I actually tried to soften a lot of what's in the book, because it's a lot scarier in practice. But it is important for us to recognise that we have two different futures in front of us, and we get to choose which one. And we still have time to do that. And like I said, the book is full of dumb solutions, like putting barrels of water underground and wearing fancy jackets, etc., etc., where we can start to deal with these things, and we don't need acts of parliament to be able to implement these changes. So I think there is hope. You can do small things. You can do things to your own house to protect yourself, from having sprinklers and misting to insulation, etc., etc. But yeah, I think I'm hopeful and optimistic, and I'm prepared with. It's probably my life's work actually now. I'm prepared to spend the rest of my life trying to help us avert the worst of what I'm aware we might end up. I hope more people join me, but even if they don't, then that's fine. You've got to try. You've got nothing to lose at this point. Might as well. Might as well. That's how I've ended it.
Absolutely.
I've moved here from Los Angeles, and as you were presenting the scope of challenges and and some of the solutions, it occurred to me that Los Angeles is doomed in every respect. Because it has been functionally a drought for the last 15 to 20 years, with one winter exception 2 years ago, I think. Are there urban environments that are just doomed? Wait, oh my God, that is the saddest thing to end on. Where is the hope in these?
For every city you give that's doomed, give a city that's gonna kick ass.
Yes. Basically, I've never felt more grateful and
Please,
moved
let's
this
end
really
on a high note, shall we?
Are there cities which are effectively doomed? I'd say no. And the reason I'd say no is because we do have time. We don't have as much time as we'd like, but we do have time. And when I was writing the book, I made a specific choice to only pick what I call dumb solutions. And I think dumb solutions are the best. They're the cheapest, they're the easiest to adopt. And I think what matters is that they are honest about what they're going to be dealing with and what those fallout conditions are going to be. So for example, I think it was, maybe it was Detroit or similar. Okay, here's the other thing I'd say. There are also cities which are dealing with these challenges ahead of everybody else a lot sooner. And so what we can do is we can learn from what those cities are doing, which is what I do in the book, look from what those cities are doing and start to prepare for how we can handle it. So for example, I think it was in Detroit, but I could be wrong. And I know that they did in Canada, weirdly enough, when they had heat waves, they had centralized cooling centers. So they were basically, town halls and similar, where they just made everything cool. They gave people water. They had the AC up maximum. And they, in some instances, they had beds for people to sleep, because a lot of the challenge around overheating is when it doesn't cool down at night. That's when you start to have lots of other challenges with regard to mental health, etc., etc. So I would say, I wrote the book because I do think there's hope, and I was going to say I was severe, but I actually tried to soften a lot of what's in the book, because it's a lot scarier in practice. But it is important for us to recognise that we have two different futures in front of us, and we get to choose which one. And we still have time to do that. And like I said, the book is full of dumb solutions, like putting barrels of water in the ground and wearing fancy jackets, etc., etc., where we can start to deal with these things, and we don't need acts of parliament to be able to implement these changes. So I think there is hope. You can do small things. You can do things to your own house to protect yourself, from having sprinklers and misting to insulation, etc., etc. But yeah, I think I'm hopeful and optimistic, and I'm prepared with. It's probably my life's work actually now. I'm prepared to spend the rest of my life trying to help us avert the worst of what I'm aware we might end up. I hope more people join me, but even if they don't, then that's fine. You've got to try. We've got nothing to lose at this point. Might as well. Might as well. That's how I've ended it.
Absolutely. Which cities are actually making huge headway?
Tokyo.
Those noble, municipalities which are doing incredible things. And Tokyo, I think, you
Tokyo,
obviously have a huge love of what they're doing
Copenhagen,
in Japan. Yeah,
New York's doing some good stuff.
it is. Yeah,
Paris is doing some good stuff.
brilliant stuff. If you think what they've done to move cars out of the city.
Fantastic.
So reasons to be cheerful. And I think on that note, I will thank you very much, and we all go and have a drink. Very